episode 51 of Zomber Prospects Radio. I'm your host, Peter Harling, and this is going to be a bit of a special edition episode, as I usually do bi-weekly episodes, but I put one out last week because next Monday, actually, a week today, is the NHL trade deadline. So it seems like a really good time to do an NHL trade deadline show and focus it on fantasy hockey and the impact it might have on some of your keeper prospects, some fringe players in the league, and I brought on a special guest to help me out with this particular episode. I'd like to welcome Steve Laidlaw. Is back on to Dobber Prospects Radio. You all know Steve as the managing editor of Dobber Hockey. He's not doing that this year, but he's a very regular fantasy hockey contributor that I'm sure you all know. So thanks for coming back onto the podcast, Steve. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm very happy to be back, Pete.
I'm happy to have you on. You're still active on Twitter answering people's random fantasy hockey questions?
Not so much with the random fantasy hockey questions, more or less just random NHL speculation and stuff like that. I've kind of steered my fantasy stuff towards just my rankings that I do once a year, and then just my own pools.
Right on. Well, I notice you still are interacting with some of the tweets that me and the podcast put out, so that's all kinds of fun. So let's talk a little NHL trade deadline. What do you say?
Oh, that sounds like the most fun time of the year.
It really is. It really is. And the NHL trade deadline corresponds with most fantasy leagues' trade deadlines. They usually have theirs either at the same day or a few days or within the week of the NHL trade deadline to allow all the fantasy owners to see how all the dominoes sort out and fall down and whatnot. So I thought maybe what we do, Steve, is just kind of start off by going through the NHL teams, maybe in alphabetical order, and just talk about who some of the NHL trade bait players that are on those rosters, and if they get moved, what that might mean to the prospects within that organization. How's that sound?
Oh, that sounds like exquisite fun. Let's run through it.
All right.
So we have to start with Anaheim, right?
That's how it works. So I noticed that Anaheim has Henrique and Silverberg as their principal players on their trade block. I'm not sure if they have anyone else on there that I'm missing, but those are the names that jumped out at me. Some prospects they have in the system that I think are relevant would be Troy Terry and Max Jones and Sam Steele, three players that are on their roster or have spent some time on their roster, bouncing between. They're all in their rookie pro seasons this year, and they've all been looking pretty good. I think it's safe to say that if Anaheim was to be active at the trade deadline, they'd be sellers and looking towards the future since they can't win a hockey game to save their life.
Mm-hmm. And like Max Jones and Troy Terry are already up with the team, but you look at Anaheim and that's a team that we already know kind of their game plan. They're going to be bringing the AHL coach up to coach the NHL team next year. So you would think they'd probably be keeping guys like Steele and Jones and Terry down with their AHL club, who's looking like they're going to be a playoff team going on a playoff run down there in San Diego. So why not keep those guys down there? Obviously, they have to find a way to field an NHL roster, but you wonder if there might be some guys scooped up off of waivers after the trade deadline just to kind of fill those spots, and they can tank away at getting a better draft pick, and then those guys can work on their game with the guy who's going to be their head coach next year.
Yeah, on the last episode I had, I saw an interesting tweet from Cap Friendly that all the Group 6 potential unrestricted free agents, and Anaheim had a couple players. One that I thought I was kind of surprised at was Andy Welinski. He's set to become an unrestricted free agent if he fails to meet a certain number of games played, and I don't think it's possible for him to meet that number of games played. He's with the team the last time I looked, but in the press box. So he's the kind of player I think that they might be willing to play him on their NHL roster and just kind of fill that placeholder unless they get some roster players in return in a trade for guys like Henrique or Silverberg or but that might be interesting to see what teams do in terms of, and we just talked about this a little bit before we started recording, and you use Ottawa as an example. Teams that have their AHL affiliate in the hunt for a playoff spot, if they clean house on their NHL roster, your point is it doesn't make sense for them to bring those players up to the NHL and jeopardize their AHL affiliates team at making a playoff and going on a playoff run, especially if they're a team like Anaheim or Ottawa where there's no chance they're going to make the playoffs. So it'd be interesting to see what teams do to fill out their rosters and if they keep their prominent prospects down in the minor leagues. That's a great point, that if you have prospects on your roster and you're licking your chops, planning on or counting on them being called up for your final stretch or playoff run in your fantasy league, you might want to take that under advisement. Okay, so that's Anaheim. Any other thoughts on the Ducks?
Well, I just, thinking, they've got a couple of decent prospect defensemen down there in Larson and Mahura. And I'm just wondering, if they went out and did something crazy like traded Cam Fowler, who I know is kind of trending towards being their franchise defenseman, but he was very much a favorite of Randy Carlyle. And now that he's out, I wonder if they would explore getting a bigger salary off in a guy like that, who probably still has a lot of people who like him in the NHL.
The return they'd be able to get for him would be very high as well. They're deep on D. They had a problem with the expansion draft with Vegas, and their depth on defense cost them Shea Theodore, a pretty good player. So they might. That's another thing that I think teams might be looking at, and you brought that up as well just before we started recording, how the expansion draft could possibly impact this NHL trade deadline, and teams that have a surplus of players in a position right now and aren't planning on making the playoffs this year might be looking at using now as an opportunity to get that under control so they don't lose players for nothing later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, that's certainly something that teams are going to be. They're already thinking about it. A number of teams have already signed backup goaltenders to 1 or 3 year, $1 million AAV contracts for the sole purpose, basically, of having a goalie to expose in the expansion draft. I think there's already been 3 or 4 of those type contracts signed. Interesting.
All right, let's talk a little bit about Arizona. They made a trade recently where they acquired Elias Pettersson's older brother, Emil Pettersson, at the expense of a couple of C-grade maybe prospects. Do you think they're done? Are they going to be buyers? Are they going to be sellers? What do you think the Arizona has in stock for the trade deadline?
I think this is a team that's always about kind of trying to find value. Or they're looking to do a deal with the Blackhawks, which seems to be, a monthly occurrence. But I would have to think that they're going to be sellers, but I don't think they want to take a ton of talent off their roster. They're also dealing with a pile of injuries, so I don't even know that they would have too many guys to sell. I know they've got pending UFA and a guy like Richard Panik, but outside of that, I don't see them doing a whole ton. Most of their good prospects have all seen some kind of time with their NHL club already this season just because of all the injuries. The one guy who hasn't seen time, and that's because of his own injuries, is Nick Merkley, and that's a guy I would very much like to see get some run in the NHL towards the end of the season. Tucson is a fringe playoff club, so they might decide, let's, this guy's just getting his legs back under him. Let's see what he can do with another year in the AHL, and then maybe challenges for a playoffs or for a roster spot next year.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I don't see Arizona as being prominent players at the trade deadline. They don't have a lot of veteran players on their roster that would be attractive for rental situations. They're not in a position to go for it, so I don't really see them being buyers. They are a young team. I think their plan is probably just going to be to stay the course. So let's move on. Boston Bruins. David Pastrnak is injured. That is a hole that they will no doubt be looking to fill, as well as getting some secondary scoring to support their big line. And of course, maybe a little bit of depth on the blue line, as all teams in playoff pursuits can never have too much depth on defense. And I like Boston's situation too. They've got all their draft picks, and they have a good selection of prospects that I'm a big fan of as well. So here's a team that I think could be right in the mix as far as even a player of Panarin stature, an impact forward. I'm not sure if they need a center, so that might rule out Duchesne. Stone could be a good option for them as well. Do you see Boston as buyers also?
I think they would have to be buyers. Like anytime you've got elite talents still producing at high levels, but in their 30s, like maximize that window. They're only going to be winning with guys like Chara and Bergeron and Marchand for so long. Take full advantage while those guys are still piling up points and really providing excellent two-way play. So finding something supplementary in behind them would be fantastic. And I think they'd be pretty flexible on whatever they bring back in return. Like they could use a third line center, or they could use a top six winger. I don't think they'd be too picky either way.
Yeah, I think they have the assets to pull off a big time deal too. I like their prospects. A lot of them have had some time in the NHL this year. A lot of time or a little bit of time, ranging from guys like DeBrusk, Donato, JFK. Don't forget about Andres Bjork, who's been injured for the better part of this season. I don't think he's set to be coming back anytime soon either. They've got Jack Stednica, Zach Senyshyn in the system as well. They've got some defense prospects that are interesting in Urho Vakanainen. And who else? Jeremy Lozon. So they just got lots of options there. Do you think that they look at packaging up a couple of those prospects and or a pick in a prospect in terms of making a swing for the fences and trying to land a Panarin?
Well, certainly, I could see them going after any kind of big game, but you hear what the insiders are talking about. They're a little bit gun shy after how things went with Rick Nash. So I do wonder if they would prefer to save some of their bigger pieces, like their first round pick and their absolute top of the line prospects, for guys who wouldn't be a rental for them. I think they would explore the rental option more if it was someone they could talk to before actually pulling off the trade and seeing if an extension is possible. And if so, I think they would plunge the larger assets in there. But I mean, with some of the names that are out there at the very high end of the market, like if you're going to be spending a first round pick, I mean, getting a guy who can drive a line like Panarin or Mark Stone, then go ahead, spend the first round pick. It's going to be in the 20s anyway. Like that pick's 50-50 chance you're even going to turn out an NHL player. So why not spend it on a guy who can absolutely change a game single-handedly?
Yeah, or follow the San Jose Evander Kane trade model, where it's a conditional first round pick if you're able to re-sign him. That might be an option that they might be willing to pallet as well. So I think there's lots of opportunity for Boston to be active at the trade deadline. I'm pretty sure that some of their prospects will be involved. Could be a good opportunity for some of their prospects to get a better opportunity as well, as Boston is a good team. They've got a full roster. They've got a full prospect bench too. So if you're a player like Cleric, you're kind of buried in the organization there. It'd be a good opportunity to maybe increase your role in a new organization. Okay, Buffalo Sabres. They have been a bit of a surprise team this year. They've done a little bit better than I think a lot of people maybe thought they would. They're in the hunt for a playoff spot. Could they possibly be buyers?
I don't see them being buyers. I don't see the sense that they need to, I don't see any way that they're going to ultimately break through beyond that huge winning streak that they had early in the season. They've been mostly a non-playoff team. So, I don't see that there's enough there that they're going to go out and really commit resources towards buying up players, especially rentals. Like what would be the point? They're not in a playoff spot the way a surprise team like New Jersey was last year, where it was like, okay, we'll reward the guys. Like they played really well. They got us back into a playoff spot. This is exciting. Okay, we're going to reward the team. We're going to go spend some fringe assets and go out and buy some rentals and see what we can do. But they're not quite at that level, and they also don't really have a whole lot to sell. So I think they're just going to kind of hold flat and be happy that they're going to be playing competitive games down the stretch. Hopefully they don't fall too far out of it, that the games become completely meaningless, and they're just going to kind of hold with what they have. And I mean, really what they should be doing is trying to bring up, a guy or two here and there, see if they can get them into some competitive games at the NHL level, and start experimenting with, what might this team look like next year.
Yeah, players like Lawrence Pilot and Victor Olofsson, or maybe even Alex Nylander. What's your take on where his status is in his career?
Well, I had him in a fantasy league at one point earlier this season, and I was more than happy to sell high on the name value of him being a recent lottery pick. I don't know. Just looking at the numbers, it doesn't seem like there's been a ton of success at the AHL level. So it's I'm not too excited about what he's done, but I would like to see what he might be able to do at the NHL level. But I think he probably has to earn that first.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Calgary Flames. They're having a very good season. They have some interesting decisions to make. Are they content with their goaltending situation? Are they content with Sam Bennett? Is he a player that they might be willing to include in a trade to land them a big fish? What do you see Calgary doing this time next week?
I'd really like to see Calgary just hold steady with what they've got. You look at what they've already got on their roster, and they're already getting huge contributions from young guys in the system. Like their third pairing with Shillington and Rasmussen has been really solid. It was good when they had Valimaki there. He's a guy who's he might come back up, although I think they would prefer to have a veteran in the mix. So maybe they shop cheap and get a nice rental veteran defenseman for that bottom pairing, but I don't think they need to go out and spend huge because, their top six is rolling. They're kind of just starting to see some returns from James Neal being added. They did a whole bunch of work in the off season reworking that roster. So why, add more reconfigurations to that just as you're hitting your stride, especially when you probably have some, internal options there with Mangiapane or Dubé being able to come up. And I mean, their AHL team is probably not a playoff team anyway. So those guys are going to be up for the playoff run. You might as well actually maybe have them play roles, rather than going out, spending future assets, maybe giving up one of those guys just to add another big piece. I mean, if you could go out and get a Stone or Panarin, then yeah, sure, spend the major assets, but otherwise just hold on, and you've already got a whole ton of a reworked roster that's playing well. So keep that going. Interesting.
All right, Carolina Hurricanes. They are definitely looking like sellers. They've got a number of players on the trade block, from Michael Furland to Dougie Hamilton, a couple defensemen as well. They're not going to be making the playoffs. What's going on with Hamilton? This will be, if he gets traded, that'll be his fourth team in about 6 seasons, maybe.
Yeah, crazy. I mean, if you looked at some of the underlying numbers of the Hamilton Giordano pairing, you might have thought actually it was Hamilton who was driving the bus there. But I mean, you look at what Giordano's doing this year, and it's like, holy mackerel! Like that guy's still friggin', top flight defensemen. So, but Hamilton's also doing really well, and he's a classic second half guy for whatever the reason is. His numbers pick up in the second half. He's doing it again, and I mean, you wrote off Carolina as a playoff team. I suppose I did the same with Buffalo, but like Carolina's right there in the playoff hunt, and I mean, they're still without their quote unquote top six centerman in Jordan Staal. He's going to be coming back pretty soon here. They might decide to treat Ferland as an own rental. I know that they want to trade a right shot defenseman so they have room to bring Adam Fox up, but like all their defensemen are really good. So you're probably looking at more of a quote unquote hockey trade if they are trading one of their defensemen. I think at this stage, it's probably Justin Falk, who's the odd man out. Whether they can get value for him or not is the question. I think the rest of the league also properly values that Pesce and Hamilton are better of that trio. So they might, not be able to get the price that they want for a guy like Falk, but he's got a year left on his deal. They should be able to get something for him. So, they've got names out there on the trade block, but I don't know that they're going to be big time sellers so much as they are quote unquote reworkers.
That's a really great point. I think they're in the market for a hockey trade. And I'm glad you brought up the name Adam Fox. I've talked about him on last week's episode after having watched some Beanpot games. And as far as I'm concerned, this is a player that's ready for prime time. He's good to go. I think Carolina is going to be highly motivated to sign him up, burn the first year of his contract for him, just to make sure that they get him under contract. Because if he goes back to college next year, all signs are pointing to him becoming an unrestricted free agent. And I think that Carolina would want to avoid that at all costs. They have other defensemen in their system as well who could be looking at a call-up, and Roland McEwen and Jake Bean. McEwen being his, I think, third season of pro now, and Jake Bean's in his first, I believe it is. So, they have a log jam on the blue line. And as we mentioned a few minutes ago, the looming expansion draft will certainly play a factor in their decision-making here as well. And not to mention Martin Netcash and Yanni Kukkonen are having great seasons in Charlotte as well. So Carolina has a whole bunch of good players, and they might be looking at trading a couple of quarters for $1 kind of trade, where they package up a prospect or two and a player off the roster in an attempt to get a non-rental player to join their roster.
And that's a team that they're just dying for some kind of top six scorer to join the mix. I mean, certainly, I was joking a little bit about Staal not being a top six center before, because they're really looking for a top six centerman with some size who can actually produce like a top six centerman that you would be expecting. I think Sebastian Aho has done fantastic work. He's their number one centerman. He is an all-star. He's a brilliant player, but it'd be nice to have more of a matchup type centerman in behind him, but one who can really produce some offense. And I think down the line, they're hoping that Martin Netcash is that guy. He's not going to be that guy this year. I don't see them giving him too many minutes this year because of that expansion draft factor. His contract's going to roll over to next season with the entry level slide. So they're not going to want to give him a full season and have him have to be exposed in that expansion draft. Right.
Really like the job that Ron Francis did in Carolina. I think he was let go too soon. Well, let's move on and let's talk a little bit about Chicago. Don't look now, but Chicago Blackhawks are kind of back in the playoff mix here. They've been red hot lately, especially Kane. So they're in that middle ground too, and it's really hard to say if they want to be buyers or sellers. They've got Anisimov's names on the trade block. They've got some prospects in the system as well, but not a bevy of them. I think Chicago just might be in a stand pat situation. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think they would sell some of the fringe veteran pieces off their roster if they could, but I think they're happy continuing to be competitive, and certainly they're happy with the returns they're getting on some of the young guys that they're bringing along. Dylan Strome in the trade, he's almost point per game now since the trade, and that was after a bit of a slow start. So new coach seems to be good with the young guys. I think a lot of folks would love to see Henry Jokiharju back up with the team, but I think his role really got diminished under the new coach with Gustafsson there taking a lot of that number one type power play role, which Jokiharju had been playing under Quenneville. So maybe just keep him down there in the AHL, and if you happen to make a playoff run, then he comes back up and gets a bit of experience that way.
And they have Adam Boquist playing in the OHL with the London Knights, doing just great. And then they also have Darren Radish, who's doing fantastic for them in the AHL. And there's another player that's part of that old Erie Otters connection, Stroman DeBrincat. So it'd be really interesting to see if Darren Radish can make the jump. He's a player that they signed as to an AHL contract out of junior as a free agent. They've since then, after his first year pro season, they signed him to an NHL contract, so they could call him up. I personally would love to see it. Remains to be seen if that'll happen or not.
I believe I saw Darren Radish just got traded.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he got traded to the Rangers for one of the Hollands. Peter Holland.
Did that happen today?
Yeah, that happened under an hour ago.
Well, there you go. Breaking news on a live to tape podcast. All right, so we'll circle back on Radish when we get to the Rangers. Colorado, they're trending away from a playoff spot. They're still within striking distance. Right now, they're 3 points out. I don't see them as having too many players that they'd be looking to sell. They could be buyers. They've got some prospects who are on the cusp. I think Cal McCarr is going to turn pro after this season. Tyson Jost has split some time between the NHL and the AHL. They've got Senators' first-round pick coming to them. They've got their own first-round pick. So there's a lot of options and different ways Colorado could go. I guess roll the dice and see what happens with them.
Yeah, I think if they're going to be anything, they're probably going to be sellers. I mean, they probably should still be in this playoff hunt, just given how dominant that top line was to start the year. But I think there's still some structural issues with the talent throughout the rest of that roster. I know Tyson Barrie is constantly rumored to be on the outs, and as you referenced McCarr earlier, he's a guy who could jump into Barrie's role maybe as early as this year. So certainly, if they could extract some more value out of trading Barrie, who's only got, I believe, a year left on his deal, that could maybe stack up a bit more talent. That's going to be along the same track line as some of the young players they've got coming up, and that could turn them into quite the juggernaut in a couple of years. Something similar to what we've seen from Winnipeg, where you get a couple of different cohorts coming up, where one is still kind of hanging on to being elite, and then you've got another pushing up through the system, and suddenly you've got top six talent playing in bottom six roles, and it's fantastic. And you're able to light up opponents on a nightly basis. So that's something that if I was planning out the Colorado roster, I'd be thinking, well, if we keep losing this year, so be it. We'll have 2 lottery picks. Those guys will be up in a couple of years, and suddenly our lineup is going to be absurd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the impact players, the core players they have now are all really young. So there's plenty of tread on the tire there in Colorado, and I wouldn't burn too much of that rubber off right now trying to squeeze in a couple playoff games this season. Columbus Blue Jackets, they're big-time players at the trade deadline. Artemi Panarin is potentially the biggest chip in the game. Bobrovsky is the best goaltender in the pool here. They could both be traded. That neither one of them could be traded. Columbus is in a playoff spot right now, so you make the argument that they are their own rental players. If I'm Jarmo Kekalainen, I'm listening to trade offers on these guys, and I would make a trade for one of these guys, but it would have to be a pretty solid return, something that has a lot of futures potential and doesn't leave me high and dry right now. And the other side of the equation with this is you look at what's in the system, and they have some pretty decent prospects. Vitaly Abramov is a player I'm really high on personally. If they move Bobrovsky, JF Berube is a fringe goalie between NHL, AHL tweener. He could come up. Emil Bemstrom is a good prospect they have playing over in Sweden. And then, of course, Sonny Milano. A lot of people may be thinking he's a bit of a bust. Some people who follow Columbus closely don't think that he is, that he's just not getting a fair shake in Columbus. So maybe he's a player that would be a good trade candidate, actually, for the Columbus. What's your thoughts on Blue Jackets?
Yeah, I mean, they could go absolutely any direction here. I mean, they're in a playoff spot, like you said. So if I was them, I wouldn't be selling. Obviously, you always listen. I don't know, if I was an NHL team, I would be listening on every single player. Just gather intel, see what's out there, right? And it would take something absolutely, bombastic for me to trade away either of those franchise type guys. I know you're not going to be able to re-sign them. That's fine. Use them as your own rentals. Go on this playoff run. Who knows? Crazy things could happen. They damn near beat the Stanley Cup champions last year. I see no reason why they couldn't, based on the playoff format, they couldn't go on a run to the conference finals, and then who knows, right? So, I mean, you talked about them having some stuff in the system. I don't know. I think their system's pretty weak myself. I don't think they have anyone who, is really chomping at the bit to come up. Certainly, you mentioned Sonny Milano. He's probably the closest to being NHL ready. Didn't they have him up earlier in the year? And Trotz was kind of like, well, yeah, like this guy's going to play in an offensive role because he's an offensive guy. And I don't know, they need offense, and he's not with the club right now. So, I have a bit of questions about whether he's actually a guy who could come up and make an impact for them. Maybe just one of those tweener guys. I don't know. I'd like to see him up again, but probably not this season unless they do some major selling. But if I'm that team, I would almost consider, taking some of those prospects that you mentioned and just pushing them in and saying, you know what, we're going all in this year. We've got, you do everything you can to get talented players like Bobrovsky and Panarin into your system so you can try to win. And then you just going to sell those guys because you can't re-sign them. Like, I get it, but you also got to make sure that you get a really, really, really strong return. Otherwise, you might as well just make the run with those guys. And I would take some of the prospects that they do have. I would try to trade them, maybe go after a Stone or a Duchesne, something like that. Like just double down and then explode the franchise after you don't sign all your UFAs.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a shift in perception in the NHL and the hockey culture and the management and the fan bases as well, where in the past the concept of losing star players to unrestricted free agency for nothing was unacceptable, unfathomable. That's terrible asset management. And then even after that happened to the New York Islanders with John Tavares this last summer, I mean, where are the Islanders now? They're doing just fine. They're all right. They inherited a whole bunch of cap space. And if anyone's in a fantasy league like the one you or I were in, the UHL, where the salary cap structure works just like it does in the NHL. You can't just drop bad contracts off your roster. You're stuck with them. It's very hard to have a roster that's full of highly valuable contributing players. Opening up $7 million in cap space from losing one player isn't a bad thing. It gives you lots of options to do things with your roster and hold on to your younger players who need new contracts or fill a hole in another position via free agency. Cap space is a very valuable asset. And if Columbus goes on a playoff run with Panarin and Bob and wins a round or two, or heaven forbid they win the Stanley Cup, and then lose both those players off the books next summer for nothing. It's not nothing. They gain a whole bunch of cap space that'll be really, really valuable. All right, that's enough on Columbus. Let's talk about Dallas Stars. The Dallas Stars they're in a playoff spot. I don't think that they're going to be sellers, and I don't think they have too many really interesting prospects that factor into this conversation, quite frankly.
No, I mean, their biggest guys are kind of already up contributing to the main team. Miro Heiskanen is, he's already a top pair defenseman. Rupa Hintz is up with the team now. I would imagine that he would be a guy that teams would target. Ty Dellandrea, their top pick from last year, probably teams would be asking about that. Their first rounder, maybe Denis Gurianov. If they can sell anyone on Julius Honka, I'm sure they would love to find a buyer for that at a high price. I think they're buyers. I mean, you look at the reaction from the front office with that whole horse shit thing, and certainly they have high expectations. Probably higher expectations than they should have. This team doesn't have a whole lot of offense. They could sure stand to go out and do some big game hunting, add a big offensive player. They've got some bigger contracts coming off the books after this year, like Jason Spezza's. So, they might have a little bit of money to play with. They're in Texas, a no tax, no state income tax state. So, that could be favorable to them re-signing one of these big names. I wouldn't be afraid to put the first rounder in play. They haven't really exactly drafted all that well with their first rounders outside of the lottery anyway. So, why not put a first rounder, whatever prospect in play, if that can net you one of the top guys on the market?
Yeah, pretty much any other prospects would be available as far as I'm concerned, with the exception of Miro Heiskanen, who not really a prospect anymore. But they've got Jake Ottinger, Colton Point between the pipes, and Jason Robertson is another player that you didn't mention, who's been at the top of the OHL scoring leaders all season long. Really like that player as a prospect. And I think they might be willing to part with him if they can fetch them a player that they think will give them what they need to win a couple rounds and do some damage in the playoffs. All right, Detroit Red Wings. They are out. They are sellers. Gustav Nyquist, maybe Jimmy Howard, Glenn Denning. Those are all players who we're hearing in the rumor mill as available. Players that they have in the system that they might be looking at calling up or giving some more opportunity to. Dennis Cholowski has kind of been between. Joe Higgins has had a cup of coffee a couple times in the NHL. I like that player. Yuri Serjarvi is another defenseman they have. I really like his offensive upside. Of course, Philip Zadina, although I think Zadina, like Neshkash, is going to be a player that they maybe try and insulate for expansion draft, to your earlier point. Let's talk a little bit of Red Wings. Where do you see them going?
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously sellers. There's been a lot of talk out of Detroit about how they don't want to tear down the infrastructure entirely. They do believe that there's a lot of value in keeping veterans around who can, who have won and will have the respect of the young guys and can teach them how to be pros. Basically, they don't want to go full scorched earth a la Edmonton because, well, we've seen how poorly that goes. Like, even if, not to go too far into the Edmonton tangent, but even if we say that the Oilers did really poorly in the Hall Larson deal, which they almost certainly did, you wonder if that trade wasn't almost required just to get Hall up to that MVP level, because he realizes, oh, this is a business. Okay, I've got to, treat this like a business, that type of thing. Like just the mental aspect of it, the off ice aspect of it. I mean, certainly on ice, like, the most talented player that had come through Edmonton until, Connor McDavid did. So you look at Detroit and, they've got some younger guys coming through, but I mean, how many young guys do you really want to have in your lineup? I think they're happy keeping some veterans around, so they're not going to sell everyone off. I think they might keep Jimmy Howard around. But just looking at the prospects that might come up, like you mentioned, Zadina, I could see him getting 5-6 games at the end of the year, but they're not going to want to burn a year off his ELC. So they're going to make sure he doesn't play more than 9 games. I think that they will have him up, but their Grand Rapids is also a good AHL team, so he can be a part of their playoff run there. They'll probably bring him up, give him a taste, keep him happy, that sort of way, but then head back down to the AHL, give us a good playoff run. Let's see what you got.
Yeah. All right. You mentioned the Edmonton Oilers. They're a lottery team again. Surprise, surprise. For Connor McDavid. So I don't know if they have much to sell. Chason, Reeder. I think they'd be foolhardy to trade Jesse Puljujarvi, but it seems like that is a legitimate possibility. They do have some young players in the system that I kind of like. Evan Bouchard, Tyler Benson, Cooper Marody, Ethan Jones, Kyle Yamamoto, Dmitry Samarukov. I'm not sure how many of those players are ready to jump into the NHL, if any, yet. What's going on with Edmonton? What are they going to do?
Well, I mean, they're probably going to try to be sellers. I know that they really wanted to have a playoff push this year. Listen, it's not in the cards. It's not going to happen. They've fallen way, way too far out of it at this point. I mean, technically, they're still in the race. I think they're like 7 points back. But realistically, like, this team hasn't been good outside of, a minor stretch in like November, December. Otherwise, they've been a lottery team, and they need to accept that. So, I really like some of the names that they've got in their AHL system, possibly coming up. We already saw Caleb Jones. He drowned when they asked him to be a top pairing guy, but he did a lot better in more of a depth role. So I think he's almost certainly going to be a guy who plays for them next year. But this is a team, they're bad. They don't have a whole lot to sell. And right now their AHL team is on a crazy run. So they're probably just going to keep, their better prospects down in the AHL, let them marinate some more. Like their highest end guys are ones who aren't even playing well anyway. So, Puljujarvi's drowning at the at the NHL level, and they won't send him down. Now he's on IR. Yamamoto just getting healthy scratched, playing 5-6 minutes a night. So now he's down in the AHL, and he's not even really a top sixer down there, just with all the talent that they kind of have been building up at that level. So I think, you might see some of the fringe guys getting called up. Like they just called up Josh Curry after putting Puljujarvi on IR. So, you might see some of those way older, way fringe guys. But in terms of like the more top prospects, like Bear and Benson and Jones, those guys are probably just going to stay down on the AHL and marinate. And hopefully they go on a really long playoff run. And, hopefully this is a bumper crop that actually is part of the next winning Edmonton team.
Yeah, protect those top prospects from the whatever is happening in Edmonton situation. I think the problems that are happening in Edmonton are the kind of things that won't be fixed at the trade deadline. They've got bigger issues to solve up top. Florida Panthers. Let's talk about the Sunshine State there. They're in the middle of a playoff hunt. They're about almost 10 points out, actually. I don't like their chances. Huberdeau's name has come up in trade rumors. I'm not sure what's going on with that. Of course, they got Derek Brassard recently, who seems to be someone that they want to flip. They've got some really great prospects. I like the Florida Panthers system. Jace Hawryluk, Borgstrom, Heppo, Niemi, Owen Tippett. Those are some players that I think I wouldn't want to move if I was Florida. So I think they might be looking at being more sellers than buyers, but sellers off their NHL roster if they've got any expiring contracts. What's your take on Huberdeau and what's going on with Florida?
Yeah, I don't really see a ton of logic around selling Huberdeau. I mean, like all the fire kind of surrounding them is about them looking to make that huge free agency splash, potentially both Panarin and Bobrovsky. the word is they kick tires on trading for them this year. Doesn't make sense to give up assets for those guys when you can go out and sign them as UFAs. And frankly, if you're signing them as UFAs, it's almost better because these guys are at an age where you don't want to commit 8 years. I would much rather commit 7 years, and the fact that it caps you out at 7 years, it can't even really be held over your head the way that or that 8th year can't be held over your head the way that it would be if you were signing with a hometown team. So that may not come at a tax of a little bit of extra AAV if they do decide they want to go big game hunting in free agency. And there's some logic to that, but why are you subtracting really talented players in their prime on value contracts to go do that? So I don't know. I think the best move is just sell off some fringe pieces. A contender's probably giving you a 5th or a 6th rounder for Troy Brouwer. So go ahead and do that. And they already got some their cap issues off, so they should be in a better position to go big game hunting in free agency. I don't know. Would they trade a higher pick to get off a salary like James Reimer's? I think that's probably something they would be more likely to do in and around the draft, just because there's a lot more flexibility to do something like that. So I don't know. Borgstrom's already up with the team now. I could see them holding pat. Maybe they trade a Derek Brassard. Like, I know they're talking about keeping him, and maybe they can sign him for cheap this summer if he really likes it down there, if he turns out to be a fit. But they're probably going to repurpose him and then just kind of grind it out to another non-playoff finish.
Yeah, it makes sense, like you said, for them to expunge themselves of some fringe players and maybe open up some roster spots for some of those prospects that I mentioned. Move some guys up onto the roster that have more upside. Los Angeles Kings are in the bottom of the basement. They are sellers for sure. They might be looking at freeing up some cap space by getting rid of players like Hagelin. Jeff Carter is an interesting player. I think they might be able to get some good return for him. They don't have a whole heck of a lot in their system. Sheldon Rempel, Kel Clegg. They recently acquired a couple of prospects in Grunstrom, Sherback, a bit of a reclamation prospect there. I think they're going to be buyers in terms of looking for prospects. So if you've got LA Kings prospects in the system, I think they're about to get some competition in your fantasy league. You see the Kings going in the same direction?
Yeah, absolutely. They're obviously sellers, and the really interesting thing with them is their AHL team is bad too. So down the stretch, you're probably going to see some guys getting called up should the minutes warrant it. Like, they've already had a bunch of guys filtering through the system just because of injuries and that sort of thing. We've already seen Matt Luff, whatever that is, make an appearance. And I'd like to see Grunstrom make an appearance, get a taste, see what he can do, maybe give him some top 6 run, just because that's a really talented guy producing at a high level in the AHL. And, he's on the trajectory that tends to portend to guys being a legitimate NHL player, even if it's, in a bottom 6 role. But, now's the time to experiment with, does this guy have some chemistry with some of our top guys? We're seeing Adrian Kempe show some flashes lately, back in a top 6 role again, when Carter was recently hurt. So, it could be valuable to bring up a guy like Grunstrom and see if he can pair with Kempe. And if they have some chemistry, suddenly that's, maybe that's your third line for next year if you're trying to be competitive then.
All right. Minnesota Wild. They are holding on to a playoff spot barely. They don't have a lot in their system. Probably buyers, probably standing pat, if not.
I think they're sellers.
Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the slide that they're on, like, it's no coincidence. They've been inconsistent all year, and they just lost their captain, most consistent player. and they already didn't have a lot of talent at the center position. Like they made the subtraction trade, trading Niederreiter for Rask just to address that positional need. And now Rask is hurt and Koivu's hurt. Like they really don't have a lot down the middle. Eric Stahl is having another contract year nightmare where I don't think he psychologically likes the situation of potentially being a rental player. If I was them, I'd be exploring, how can we get this guy under contract so we get him playing comfortably again. He wants to be there. He'd probably sign at a reasonable amount. Certainly, you don't want to be investing too much term or AAV in an older guy, but he's all you have at the center position. Clearly your team still wants to make the playoffs. But you can do a little bit of both. And with a guy who wants to be there anyway. And they don't have a ton to call up to keep themselves in the mix anyway. So I think they'll sell off some pieces. They've already been experimenting with it, but they're not going to be buyers because they really don't have anything to hang their hat on in terms of buying. Like they would just be setting themselves really farther back if they hadn't bought.
Whatever they do, I don't think they'll be prominent players come the next week. Montreal Canadiens, they are holding on to a roster spot also in the playoffs, a wild card. Don't really have a read on Montreal in terms of expiring contracts or prospects that they have that I'm interested in. What's your take on the Habs?
Well, they've already said that they don't want to do anything for a rental, but I mean, it's Bergevin. He says whatever he's going to say, and then he's going to do what he's actually going to do, right? Their AHL team is one of the worst out there. So, whatever prospects they do have are probably going to be making their way up. They've had a bunch of guys who are kind of back and forth between the NHL and AHL all season, specifically on defense, like Noah Jolson and Victor Mete. Those guys have been kind of riding back and forth. Probably their top prospects at this point, if we're not counting Kotkaniemi, they're all playing either overseas or in college. So these guys aren't going to be making an impact right away unless, Ryan Paling's team falls right out of it and they're able to get him signed to a contract lickety split. And maybe he comes in as a ace in the hole that way. But otherwise, I think they'll be adding, but they're not going to be, spending big prospects to do it.
Right. Nashville Predators have been rumored to be interested in big guns like Panarin as well.
Sign me up for Eli Tolvanen getting traded.
Right? Yes. I think that would do him a world of good if you own him in a fantasy league and he gets traded for whomever. You'd be happy about that. Plus, they also have Fabro coming up from college as well. I think he's going to be playing for Nashville before the season is over. I put Nashville down as clear-cut buyers. Do you agree?
Absolutely. They're buying. This is their window. They're probably going to start looking at expansion draft type maneuvering as early as the off season. But right now it's how can we push chips in to get better? Like they bought Cody McLeod, which goodness knows what that does for them. But they also spent a second round pick on Brian Boyle, who he plays in all phases. So that clearly this is a team that's buying. I think Tolvanen is probably highly available just because of how good the rental players are that are available. Like, you don't want to give up a guy like Tolvanen, especially like when you're able to get him with a late first round pick, and then suddenly, well, maybe this guy was actually a top 10, top 15 talent. So you got a lottery pick without actually having a lottery pick, which is fantastic. But if you've got the chance to trade him in for a run with Panarin, well, you do that. And I would have no issues pushing that chip in there for an absolute first-line player. So I have to get Mark Stone or Artemi Panarin if I'm putting that chip on the table. But I would have no issues putting that chip on the table to get that kind of player.
Would you agree that it increases his fantasy value as well?
Most likely, because I mean, when's he going to get those top line minutes in Nashville when they've already got two dynamite top line wingers? Whereas, on a weaker team, weaker expectations, maybe he can get 18 minutes a game with top line power play minutes. So, yeah, I would certainly be interested in Tolvanen on a weaker team that might decide, hey, let's give this kid some run. But the flip side is he's probably not getting too much run this year because he's another one of those below 20-year-old players playing in the AHL. So, no one's going to needlessly expose them to the expansion draft if they're not winning anyway. So why bring them up?
Fair enough. All right, moving right along. New Jersey Devils. They are in a lottery pick position for sure. I think they're going to be sellers. Johansson, Lovejoy, those kind of guys. Nothing terribly impactful. I don't think that they have a lot of prospects that they'd be looking at calling up either. Maybe Mike McLeod, who's in the AHL. The rest of their top prospects are in junior. I don't see them as being really prominent players at the deadline.
No, they're sellers, but they've only got really fringe pieces to deal with. With all their injuries, though, like they've had a ton of guys kind of up and filling different roles for them. Like Brett Seney he's played like top 6 minutes for them at certain times. Joey Anderson, when he's not been hurt, he's been playing a role. We've seen Quenneville up playing a role for them as well at various times this year. Like their system is getting stretched by all the injuries that they've had. So we've seen a lot of guys already kind of get some exposure. Joey Anderson's a guy that I really like. So, hopefully he can be healthy for the rest of the year and, show you some flashes of what he might be able to do on a winning team.
Indeed. All right, we spoke about the Islanders a minute ago with the John Tavares signing. They have been having a very surprising season. They are not even in a wild card spot. They're just in. They're in it with 76 points. I'd be looking at them as potentially buyers. And I think they've got a couple really interesting chips and prospects that you'd be able to get from them that I think they'd be really interested or willing to move. And that's Josh Hosang, who has been a bit of an enigma, and Michael Del Cole, who's finally starting to come around at the AHL level. Those are kind of reclamation prospects. They've got some other prospects as well, the other Sebastian Aho, Kiefer Bellows, Oliver Wahlstrom. So there's a lot to work with the New York Islanders. I think they're kind of in a similar situation as the Boston Bruins. They're looking at supplemental offense, and they got a lot of pieces they can play with. Do you see it that way too?
Yeah, I mean, the book on Lou Lamoriello is he's not going to add at the trade deadline unless he thinks he can win it all. So can this team win it all? I don't know. So the argument that you would make is their division is crap. Like the Metro, no one is, showing themselves to be elite. Why couldn't they make the conference finals? And then who knows what happens?
Well, Washington and Pittsburgh are in their division.
Right. But those teams have been playing like doggy doo-doo all year. So you could see
but their recent pedigree. Yeah, their recent pedigree, though, is they're hogging all the Stanley Cups.
Mm-hmm. No, and I agree with you. Like, if I was the Islanders, I would hold fast. Like, who's to say that whoever they would go out and add, like, unless they're absolute big game hunting and getting Panarin, like, how are you pulling that off? What kind of future are you mortgaging to get Panarin? Could you trade an expiring guy like Eberle and Hosang, who doesn't seem to be in your plans anyway, to get him? Like, I don't know that that's going to be enough. So I wouldn't mortgage any of the future, and I would be experimenting with bringing Hosang up, seeing if he can add that offense for you. What about Otto Koivula? Could he be, he's almost point per game as an AHL rookie, I believe. And I mean, at 20 years old. So, could he be a trade deadline addition, but you're doing it in-house instead of actually having to make a trade?
Yeah, I think the Islanders have a lot of options, and they'll be an interesting team to follow as well. And their counterparts in New York, the Rangers, are out of a playoff spot by about 10 points, so they're going to be sellers as well. They've got a lot of players that I think they could be looking to make available: Kevin Hayes, Zuccarello, McQuaid, Kreider, to name a few. They do have some interesting prospects: Elias Anderson, Philip Hedl, Anthony DeAngelo, Strome. So they've got some prospects in the system, but I think they'll be looking to clear some roster space on their NHL roster with as being sellers.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. These guys are selling, except for when they're buying radishes.
Yeah. Right.
But
full circle there. Yeah,
absolutely. But yeah, I mean, they're, Hartford, the Wolfpack, they're not going to be an AHL playoff team. So, very good opportunity for any prospects playing at that level to get some run at the NHL level after this big sell-off happens. Depending on whether it does happen or not, they've certainly got a lot of guys on expiring deals who could be on the move out. I just wonder if they're going to be able to make all the trades that they want to make up leading up to the deadline. Like, certainly some of the groundwork has already been done, but they've got a lot of guys to move out if they want to sell off all their rentals, and even the guys with a year remaining on the deal, like Kreider and Nemesnikov. Like, they've got a lot of guys who could be on the move. Are they even going to be able to make all these moves?
Maybe not at the trade deadline, but then there's the draft as well. They do have a lot of, and they've been acquiring prospects for some time now. So, and they've been doing a really good job of stockpiling young talent, making some great draft picks. Kravtsov and Keandre Miller at the draft last year. They made an additions of Brett Howden and Lior Hayek from Tampa Bay last year as well. So yeah, I think they're definitely in a fast forward rebuild phase where they're acquiring assets at an exponential rate that are prospects and young players. So I don't expect that to change at the trade deadline. All right, the big gun in the whole shebang that's probably going to get everything started would be the Ottawa Senators. I think once they start making their decision on whether or not they can sign Duchesne or Stone, that's when it's going to hit the fan, and the trades are going to start pouring in. So Ottawa, clearly sellers, despite the fact that they don't have their first round pick. They are at the bottom of the NHL standings. Colorado is just absolutely loving this. Duchesne and Stone, big guns. Don't forget Dzingel, Ceci, Bodker. We mentioned their top prospects playing in the AHL. Batherson, Brown. Those are players that you're likely not going to see get called up for the end of the season as they're pushing for a playoff run in the AHL. I think the Sens are going to trade one or if both of their big guns. I'm not a hockey insider, but that's just me talking. I think there's the opportunity for them to think, well, we're already pot committed with Duchesne. Let's sign him up to an 8-year contract that's way more than what he's worth. Just compounding a mistake and making it even worse going forward for another almost decade. Personally, if I were a Sens fan, I'd be hoping that they could trade him and avoid that bad decision. And so long as the return that they get is amenable. How do you see the Sens doing this trade deadline?
I just keep coming back to, how do you lose a guy like Stone? Like, how? And we have no idea whether he's amenable to stay or not, but just like, who are you going to spend money on? So just unload it. $12 million a year, 8 years, $96 million. Let's do this. Like, why not?
Because that's a long time. And
yeah.
while that fits into their situation, okie doke for now, that might not be the case come 3 years from now. And then you still have 5 years term on that contract.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, why do you own a professional franchise if you're not going to re-sign superstars? Like, assuming he's willing to sign, right? Like, why even be in the professional sports business if you're not going to keep, like, This is a top 30 player for sure. Like, he'd be the best player on half of the NHL teams, roughly, like somewhere in that range. Maybe less than that. Maybe only a third. But clearly, a franchise player. Give him the franchise money. Figure out the rest. Like, what are you getting that's replacing that? And they've actually, like you alluded to, like, they've got some really good prospects in the system. But like, in 3 years, Stone's probably still going to be worth $12 million. So it's not going to kill you to do that. He's the type of guy who's probably going to retain his value, being as elite two-way as he is. I don't know. I would be really doing everything possible to keep him there. And I mean, if they can't, then so be it. You know, they go out and make those trades. And hopefully they're getting some really good young talent back in return.
And draft picks. Yeah, look, the Senators, this is a topic that I've been toying with bringing up on the podcast for about a year now. They've been just a super duper dumpster fire for a long, long time, and they're making bad decisions. And I'm not sure that that's about to stop. So I think this trade deadline could be really interesting, and I think it could result in fans throwing jerseys on the ice before the season's over, or waffles, or whatever the Ottawa equivalent is going to be. It's going to be interesting to watch, regardless. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about the Philadelphia Flyers. They're kind of in the hunt. Probably not really. They probably should be a seller, especially with guys like Wayne Simmons, who they might not be able to afford anyways. They do have some good prospects in their system. I like Philadelphia's situation. I think they've got some really great players on their team, young and old, I suppose. They have a nice mix. I think if they play their cards right, they could really put themselves in a really good situation for next season. What do you think Philadelphia's going to do?
Oh, that poor GM that gets left holding the bag and giving Wayne Simmons a long-term contract this summer.
Right.
Oh boy, yeah. It's kind of flabbergasting. Like, I know that it takes a long time for people's opinions to catch up, like with player reputations. It takes a lot longer for it to fade. Like, Simmons isn't the guy that people make him out to be. Like, he hasn't been for 2 years. So I think whatever they can get for him. I mean, like, heck, they might pick up a fourth liner off some other teams just to match contract numbers, and that player might actually be more impactful than Simmons. Like, certainly, I can't speak to his locker room impact or the value of his physical intimidation, but just in terms of pure on ice results, he's not even an elite special teams guy anymore. Like, he hasn't been doing it as an elite net front guy at all this year. Like, they would be much better served getting James Van Riemsdyk into that spot where he's been elite, as early as, or as recently as last season. So Simmons hasn't been the guy that people think he is for 2 years. I think sell him, get what you can. They've got a ton of good young players on their way up. Philippe Myers just had his NHL debut. It's exciting times going forward. They built things up the right way under Hextall. Let's hope Fletcher doesn't ruin all that pain and good work that they and patience that they went through to accrue all this young talent.
Another GM I didn't think deserved to be fired. Interesting points you made there about Wayne Simmons and his perceived value. I think a lot of that has to do with players' contracts, and he has had a great value contract when he was a producing player, and because that perception was allowed to be created, I think he's riding on the momentum of that still. And then as soon as you have a player that goes from having a value contract to an expensive contract, their stats and their performance on the ice might not change, but all of a sudden the perception of their value certainly does. And they go from being from a great player to the GOAT, the guy wearing the goat horns. Dion Phaneuf would be a good example of that, perhaps. Anyhow, I hope that doesn't happen with Simmons. I own him in one of my fantasy leagues, so we won't trash talk him anymore here. Okay, so Pittsburgh Penguins. They like winning championships as long as you've got Crosby and Malkin on your team. I think you go for it. So I think they'll be wearing their buyer's hat, but I don't know what they have to buy with. They've kind of spent all of their reserves, right? They maybe some draft picks, but
they've got their first round pick. I don't know.
Yeah.
They don't have a whole heck of a lot else.
Yeah. So, all right, let's blow by Pittsburgh. San Jose is another team I think we can kind of blow by. I think they've done their free agent acquisition already and getting Erik Karlsson at the beginning of the season. Signing Evander Kane. I think San Jose would like to be buyers. I'm not sure that they have a whole lot of assets to be buying with. And like I said, I think they've already done their investment with the adding Erik Karlsson. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm fully on board with that. Like they've never been a team that's ever had like a loaded system, but it always seems like whoever their top guys are, they do a very good job of making sure that those players get slowly integrated and end up playing key roles. Like it's not too often, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they sell a prospect and he ends up coming back to bite them. We haven't seen that a lot, and this is a team that has made a lot of trades of prospects. Charlie Coyle would be the one guy who's gone on to prominence, and he's only been in every Minnesota trade rumor since he's been there.
Yeah, for sure. All right, another interesting team, the St. Louis Blues. It was around Christmas time. Everyone was available. They were trading everyone, and then they call up Jordan Binnington, the savior. Now they're in a playoff spot. They're not even in a wild card spot. They're in a playoff spot. I don't know if you would consider them to be sellers anymore. I mean, Braden Shen, Colton Parayko, Steen, Bouwmeester, even Tarasenko's name was mentioned as available earlier, but I think all bets are off now. I think they're back into the buyer phase.
I wouldn't buy.
So long as they have faith in Jordan Binnington. If he can keep doing what he's doing.
Well, you almost have to. So St. Louis is very much in a similar position as Calgary in that they made so many off-season moves, and it took till halfway through the year for their big guns to finally get going. O'Reilly's been killing it for them all year, and it's nice that the rest of the team decided to join them, and suddenly they're a good team. Like these guys have been crazy, and maybe a good chunk of that is Binnington's been playing well for them, so now they've got confidence to play in front of them. Now everything's falling into place. Listen, Binnington could be a mirage, but who's the goalie that you're going out and getting, especially for a franchise that has already done the big game hunting at the deadline of a goaltender, and it didn't work? So, don't go down that road again. Like, you never know. Like, if you really don't have a goaltender, then you can go out and you can make, the Devin Dubnyk edition, his first year in Minnesota. Suddenly, okay, this team's taken off because they had nothing for goaltending all year. And you could have said that in St. Louis up until Binnington came along. Now they've got a guy. Like, don't spend huge assets grabbing a goaltender because you don't know if he's going to fit. Like, how is the integration between the system and the goaltender going to work to make sure that soft goals aren't being allowed, that there's really good communication? Like, all that chemistry stuff takes a lot of time to build. And right now it's working. So I wouldn't mess with that. They've got a ton of really good prospects in the system, and a lot of them are close to knocking on the NHL door. Like, these guys are in a good spot where, some of their veterans are going to be aging out, and these young guys are going to be ready to hop right into bigger roles just as those guys are aging out. So I think they're in a very good spot. You don't go out, don't fuck with happy, right? they're happy right now. Like they look like playoff locks at this point. I wouldn't mess with it. It took you all season to figure out your chemistry. Now it's going well. Keep going with it.
What difference a few months makes, right? Where it looked like it was going to be a fire sale in St. Louis, and now we're saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's
absolutely. Props to Craig Berube, because they finally turned the bus around.
Well, show me a team with a good coach, I'll show you a team with a good goalie, is the old saying, right?
That too.
All right, Tampa Bay Lightning. I don't know about you, but for my money, these guys might just be the very team to beat this year for the Cup. The Stanley Cup's going to go through Tampa Bay one way or another, I think, and I think that they could want to be buyers. The trouble that they're going to have is salary cap situations. So if they're looking at buying, it's got to be a rental, because they've got some real problems with the salary cap next season. So they're not going to want to add any layers of complication to that unless it involves moving out some money. But could you imagine if this is a team that went out and had the wherewithal to acquire an Artemi Panarin and add him into their roster? I'm not sure that Tampa Bay has the ability to make any kind of significant move. What do you think?
Yeah, they're in a tough spot. Like, I don't know, they pull prospects out of nowhere and turn them into, top six forwards. So
Carter Verhaeg.
Exactly. So they are in, they're a model system at this point, which you wouldn't have said 10 years ago, but here they are. They've done a great job of building to this point. They'd love to be buyers. Their first rounder's already kind of committed. If they win the Cup, it goes to New York. Otherwise, it's second rounder. So you'd have a tough time selling that piece. It would have to be conditional to whomever gets it. And then, next year, if they're thinking maybe it might be a bit of a step back year just because of some of the cap problems, then they probably don't want next year's out the door, when, they would want to be able to have more flexibility to rework things cap wise during the summer. So, I mean, they've been running over everyone all year. They're in a position where there's 7 defensemen. They're rotating guys through every night. So like every guy gets a night off every 2 weeks. So they're probably even going to be like one of the fresher teams heading into the year or heading into the playoffs, just because of how they're rolling things. It seems like they've got an entire 5th line worth of guys that would be, high-end 4th liners for a lot of teams. So they've got remarkable depth. Almost all of it was created through last year's trade deadline buying, and then just through solid drafting and development. So again, that's another situation. Like, don't mess with it. Like, they could add a few more depth pieces, but like, who are you pushing down? That, I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. I think that they have got a very elite team already. It would be hard to improve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Don't mess with chemistry, like you were saying. All right. Toronto Maple Leafs. Finally, a team that's back in the playoff picture again. Already made an acquisition, adding a defenseman to their roster. Jake Muzzin might be interested in adding another one. Might be interested in adding a little bit of depth up front. They've got players like Andreas Johnsson and Kapanen that are needing new contracts in the offseason. They're going to have a little bit of trouble fitting in their salary cap situation. So those are players that have been rumored as potentially being available, which doesn't make any sense to me. They won a championship with the Marlies last season in Calder, so I'm not sure why they'd want to move them, because they're very affordable right now and they have a chance to win right now. I think the Leafs would definitely like to be buyers. And while it looks like they have some salary cap room, if you look, they have about $4 million in space, but they need to reserve that for players' bonuses. Otherwise, that'll carry over into next season's salary cap situation, and I think they want to avoid that at all costs. What do you think the Leafs could be up to?
Yeah, I think they already made their big purchase. They moved early. You look at what they've done the last couple of deadlines, and the guys that they added really didn't do anything for them as far as pure rentals. So they were willing to put their first rounder on the line for a guy who's going to be with them for multiple seasons. So if they're going to add another guy, it's going to have to be money in, money out, and then also like it's going to have to be a guy who makes sense for them beyond just this season. And I don't know that type of piece is going to be available. You almost certainly they're going to add a cheap rental piece for a late round pick, just because that's what teams in their position do. But I don't think it's going to be a guy who's going to make a huge impact. And they're not going to be selling anyone who's NHL ready to a team in order to add that fringe rental. So, and they're certainly not going to be giving up either Sandin or Liljegren. So those guys are pretty locked in. You're not going to see them at the NHL level this year. Again, that entry level slide for guys under the age of 20. Those guys are just going to keep plugging away for the Marlies, who are kind of a fringe playoff team this year. So, I don't see a ton moving prospect wise. You maybe see Trevor Moore back up if some injuries crop up for the Leafs, but otherwise, I think they're pretty set.
Yep. All right, Vancouver. They're having an interesting season. Elias Pettersson has them right in a playoff spot. They're just on the bubble. They have a whole bunch of tremendous young prospects and assets. Alex Edler's name is a player who TSN had listed as trade bait. I don't see it necessarily. I think that they're wanting to have a veteran defenseman to lead that blue line, and I don't see anyone better than Alex Edler for that position.
Well, and he wants to stay, right? So
right.
It just makes sense for both parties to keep him there. He's got a concussion right now. Like, who knows when he's even going to be back?
Right. So scratch his name off the list. That doesn't leave them with a whole lot of stuff to be selling. They might want to be buyers and try and push their way into that one of those final wild card spots. Do you think that that's something that they consider, or do they just, they're on a rebuild course. They're going on a youth movement. If they miss the playoffs, I don't think it would be the end of the world. They give themselves another lottery pick, albeit a low percentage one, but a lottery pick nonetheless.
I think that they could talk their way into doing like the type of Patrick Maroon type rental that happened last year. Like, you give up a third and you add a guy who's a middle six type winger who might fill a specific role for you. I know they went out and they did the Gagne for Spooner trade, where they traded each other's AHLers, and they're gonna try to turn them into NHLers with their new teams. So I think Spooner's getting the top line run right away. So we'll see what happens with them. But no, I don't think they're going to sell any of their big pieces to make a push. They're not permanently in there enough to be able to do that. Maybe if Edler was still healthy, I think they'd be making a better run at this. The with or without, as far as Edler goes, has been I think it's been pretty stark this year. So I don't think they're going to hang in that playoff race, but you never know. Certainly in terms of names we might see pop up. We've already seen Demko and Gaudette making an appearance, and it's almost certain that Quinn Hughes, whenever his college season is done, is going to be signed. Don't expect him to play more than 9 games. Again, that entry-level slide, they're going to want to keep him from having to be exposed in the expansion draft, so he's not getting more than 9 games this year.
Right. Yeah, Vancouver's got a lot of players that I think that they could just call on from Utica if they wanted to. And I don't think that they want to take away roster spots with long-term acquisitions from some of their prospects. Vegas, expansion team that makes it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals last year, will be looking to repeat. They've added some players to their team this year in Stastny and Pacioretty, some pretty impactful players. They were in it on Erik Karlsson, but came up short in that trade, obviously. This is a team that I don't think should be very active in terms of buying, and I don't think they have anything to sell either. I think this is going to be a pretty quiet trade deadline for Vegas.
So I was banging around the idea of what a team like Vegas could do to push up their risk profile just a bit. Certainly, they could sell off prospects like Glass or Brandstrom, and they could probably net a damn good rental return. But I wonder if something even spicier could be in the mix for them. It wouldn't really be prospect related, but before Max Pacioretty's his new deal kicks in, would you be able to move him to Columbus for Panarin? You get the better player. You're probably only getting him for a year, but maybe you get a chance to re-sign him. And then you avoid what would be an aging contract in Pacioretty, and you really, you get that superstar player who could change the outlook of a team that's, they're fading a little bit. Like, they're certainly a playoff team, and they'll certainly make noise, but the magic isn't quite what it was.
Yeah, they caught lightning in a bottle last year, and that's always hard to recreate. And sometimes the harder you try, the further it gets away from you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Cup champions, Washington Capitals. They made very few changes to their roster from when they won their Cup, so they should be in good position to go for another run. They got a lot more experience after their run last year. They're all a little older, maybe a little hangover. Doesn't look like this season. They're doing just fine, winning all kinds of games.
They've been slumping since Christmas, but I think they'll be fine.
Yeah, they're still second overall in the Metropolitan, so they're good. They don't have a very deep prospect pool to draw from. They've been trading first-round picks for a long time now, making playoff pushes. They still have their pick this year, I believe. I'd like to think that because they won one, their appetite for trading first-round picks maybe has diminished a little bit. I mean, they won, they got it, they scratched that off their list, and they got to look at their prospect bench and think, we could really use some top-end players coming down the pipe here eventually. Do you think that they see it that way? They're like, hey, man, this is our chance. This is our window. All in. Trade them.
No, I think I read something from Brian McClellan recently, where he was talking about how the Shattenkirk all-in move a couple of years ago was really an eye-opener for them, just in terms of how it really didn't move the needle the way that they thought it would. And then last year, they made much more fringe moves. And they ended up having Michael Kempney, who they got for a much lower pick, ended up playing a top pairing role for them, and he's been in that spot ever since. And they go out and win the Cup. So they're probably going to make some additions. It's probably going to be smaller adds, and they're probably not going to be trading from their top prospect pool. It's more likely going to be lower rung picks that they trade from. Maybe the most interesting piece that could go down for them would be what happens if there's a Holtby injury. Do we get to see Ilya Samsonov at the highest level? Is he ready for that yet?
That would be interesting. All right, last but not least, Winnipeg Jets. So here's a team that a lot of people have as the potentially strongest Cup contender coming out of the West. They got a fair number of good young players in their system. I don't think it's realistic to think that they'd be sellers. They should be buyers. They could be selling prospects to load up and add that one or two missing pieces that they feel they might have to put them over the top and make them invincible. Are they satisfied with their goaltending? Do you think they'd be looking at a forward or a little bit of depth on D?
I think they're definitely buying. My kind of hot take for Winnipeg is that they aren't that good. I mean, certainly they're hanging at the top of the Central. They're obviously good, but I don't think they're quite championship level good. They have quite a few holes, which can be patched up at the trade deadline. The question is, how expensive is that going to be? They are certainly they're a candidate to go out and make the Michael Kempney type move, because I think they're missing something along those lines. A guy, they've got the great Morrissey Trouba pairing, but they're still looking for the guy who's going to pair up well with Byfuglien. Maybe they solve that internally with a guy like Sami Niku. And certainly he's going to be a guy that teams ask for if they go big game hunting to patch up the holes that they feel they have up front. They could probably stand to have a second line center similar to what they did with Stastny last year. But yeah, I think that this is a team with a couple of holes, but they're also fairly obvious. So if they can figure out the way to fill it properly without expending too many resources, and they've got a heck of a lot of good prospects that they can sell, still have their first rounder as well. So they've got some pieces to do that hunting with. It's just a question of whether they can find the right pieces coming back.
That's it. 31 teams. We made it. Only an hour and a half.
That was a haul.
That was a long marathon. Cool, man. Well, I got you on the pod. Is there anything else you wanted to talk prospect wise?
Well, yeah, I kind of wanted to reverse course on you and ask you some questions, because, I'm not in the prospect game nearly as much as other folks. And so, I thought it'd be valuable just as a fantasy player and someone, I like to get as much out of these conversations as I can, and hopefully, maybe pry some information out of you that you didn't necessarily know that you were sitting on or didn't think to share. So you're a Leaf fan, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So what's the division rival prospect that you are most afraid of?
Prospect. So a prospect owned by another team in the least division.
Yes.
Gee, I don't know. Boston's got a number of good ones. I wouldn't say that there's anyone there that I'm particularly afraid of. Buffalo's got some guys that are on their roster, of course. Rasmus Dahlin is incredible, and I'm a big Casey Middlestat fan as well. Maybe Zadina in Detroit, or Heponiemi in Florida. Those are some players that I think are going to enjoy playing in the NHL and score a lot of points, and they're going to be playing against the Leafs a lot, so they're going to be scoring a lot of points against Toronto.
Right. So along similar lines, which team's prospect pool are you most jealous of?
Vancouver.
Yeah.
I like a lot of the players that Vancouver has in their system. They've got pillars in each position. Elias Pettersson, obviously. Brock Besser, if you still count him as a prospect. Quinn Hughes on defense. Thatcher Demko in goal. Just going right on down the list, I'm a big fan of Michael DiPietro. Tyler Madden has been lights out at the World Juniors with USA. He's having a great season at the World Juniors with USA. Yeah, he's had a great season in NCAA. I just watched him in the Beanpot, and kid's got some moves. I like what Jet Wu's doing. I think he's going to bring an element to their blue line. Zach McEwen is a player I'm pretty familiar with too. Watched him play in Gatineau quite a bit when he was there. As an undrafted free agent signing that they made. Just their prospect roster throughout is just full of players that are favorite prospects of mine. And Vancouver just keeps drafting them. It's almost like they're looking at my list and picking guys off my own draft list. So I really like Vancouver. Carolina is another one too. I like a lot of the prospects that the Carolina Hurricanes own. I'd like to own those guys in my fantasy league.
Pete, this was a nightmare segment for me, an absolute nightmare. Okay, so Oilers fan, the answer to my first question from myself would have been Quinn Hughes, and here you are spouting off Vancouver, who I'm also fairly jealous of their prospect system. Every day I feel like I want to mute Cam Robinson on Twitter because he won't stop talking about their glorious pipeline
True.
updates on how well each and every one of those fantastic prospects are doing. It's going to drive me insane for the next decade having to watch those guys. I wish them nothing but the best.
No. Don't get me wrong. Vancouver's a team I love to hate. I dislike the Vancouver Canucks almost as much as Montreal, but I gotta say I love their prospects. Anyway, and next question.
Okay, so along similar lines, so who is the draft prospect you are most afraid winds up in Tampa Bay?
Well, assuming Tampa Bay is going to be picking kind of late in the draft, that eliminates, the front end big names. A player I really like, and a bias because I've seen him in the OHL a bit, and I think he's really underrated, is Philip Tomasino. I really like this guy. I think he's going to be drafted lower than he should be, and he's going to have an impact. He's fast. He's Charlie Hustle. He reminds me a little bit of Mark Stone. Maybe not quite as offensively gifted, but Mark Stone just competes so hard. He creates so many turnovers, forces the other team to make passes and decisions that they immediately regret. And then when he gets an opportunity, he just cashes on it. So I think he's got an opportunity to turn out to be that type of player. So it wouldn't surprise me for Tampa Bay to identify that. They're pretty good at doing that kind of stuff. And then, if I'm right, of course, and then have that happen would be a nightmare situation.
So that just about fills a similar model to my answer to that question, who would be Nick Robertson. So as far as I'm concerned, Tampa Bay is either winning the cup and conveying their first round pick to the New York Rangers, or they're not winning it. They're keeping their first, and then they're going to draft someone who is absolutely going to torment us all for 10 years. So there's no escaping what the Lightning have created.
It's true.
Okay, so Pete, if you were rebuilding a fantasy team, which draft class would you focus on? 2019, 2020, 2021, or would you say, you know what, none of those draft classes are good enough, try to win now?
So that would probably depend on how bad my team is. I don't mind the 2019 draft class. I think there's some players on there that can help you out. 2020's looking pretty good too. I haven't paid as much attention to future drafts as I do to the one that's coming up right away. But 2020's got some pretty big names in it. Alexis Lafreniere, Quentin Byfield, really like him. Marco Rossi, a player who's playing with the Ottawa 67s as an import rookie. Anton Lundell from Finland is a player that I've been hearing a lot of really good things about. Alex Holtz. So I might look at 2020, but I wouldn't want to put it off too long because, I mean, just look at what Vegas did. They came from nothing and went to a Stanley Cup contender. And I think that you're seeing players come from the NHL draft and having an immediate impact in the NHL faster than ever before. So if you're looking at doing a rebuild, I think there's ways to acquire players and draft players that you don't have to have the 5-year rebuild anymore. So projecting it starting your rebuild a few years away doesn't make sense. Like if you're good, go for it. If you're not good, start your rebuild right away.
Interesting. Okay. Let's see here. So speaking of the 2019 draft, where do you think the inflection point is where, the talent really starts to drop off? So if I'm, say rebuilding a team and I happen to have 6 first-round picks, of which probably most of them will be occurring in the top 20, where is the talent level really going to drop off where I want to start thinking, okay, maybe I got to get rid of some of these picks outside a certain range because they're not going to return talent the way that I want them to? That's
interesting. So recently posted on Dobber Prospects the fantasy ranking, the NHL draft. And it's a consensus ranking. So there was about 6 or 7 of us that contributed to it. So it's not just my opinion, but I contributed to it, obviously. So the top 3 were pretty unanimously Hughes, Kakko, and Podkolzin. And then there was not a lot of separation point-wise when I added up all of the rankings between the next large group of players. So that includes, Dylan Cozens, Trevor Zegras, Peyton Krebs, Alex Turcotte, Matt Boldy, Kirby Dotch. These are all Bowen Byram. These are all players who, people had ranked anywhere from 10th to 4th or 5th. Alex Newhook, Cole Caulfield, Ryan Suzuki. Now you're starting to get these players were ranked anywhere from like 7 to 15 on most people's lists. Arthur Kaliev, some people had him ranked really high. Some people had him ranked pretty low. He's a sniper. He's a goal scorer, but he's got some pretty big holes in his games, namely consistency. But then after that, I think that's where you see this inflection that you're talking about. So all of the players that I mentioned in the top like 14 or 15 were ranked pretty consistently, pretty high. And then the rest of the list, they were ranked pretty consistently below that. Not a lot of movement between the rest of the list, with the odd exception. So I would say at about midway through the first round, if you don't have someone in the top 15, then you're not probably looking at an impact player right away. But I mean, who knows? Players get picked 30th overall and make the NHL in their first year. So, but that's the way it's looking to me at this point.
Well, awesome, Pete. Yeah, that was a really good piece. I love that consensus fantasy rankings that you guys put together. It's a really strong piece, and I think that answer provides some really good context for me. So that was not a hypothetical. I am rebuilding a team that has 6 first-round picks this year. We'll be looking to make some big splashes with that.
Where are they ranked, roughly?
Right now, it looks like I'm going to have 2 in the top 5, and then a bunch in that 6 to 15 range. 3 more of them in that range, and then one's probably going to be in the 17, 18, 19, 20 range.
All right. Well, in the later range, I always try to look at players who you will maybe sort of get some indication as to whether or not they're worth holding on to and keeping on your prospect bench for a long time. So you look at maybe an overage player like Brett Leeson, around there. He'll be turning pro probably next year. So, if he craps the bed in the AHL, then maybe you look at freeing up that roster spot. But you'll know sooner than later, right? Because he doesn't have 2 more years or 3 more years of junior or college where you have to wonder what's he going to be like as a pro.
That's an interesting strategy, the Tanner Pearson approach.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. Okay, running short on time. I'll just skip to the last question here. So, what are some things that you've stolen from other fields, either hobbies or your job or other interests, that apply to scouting and fantasy hockey?
Well, my day job as a retail manager, I'm always looking at succession planning. And what do I do if I lose this person? Who's going to step up and fill that position? And that's something that I kind of do with my fantasy team too, right? Like, what do I do if such and such a player loses their value, gets traded to a team and or signs a contract or as a free agent and they're off my roster, or I let them go as a free agent, or someone makes me an offer I can't refuse and now I don't have a goalie, kind of thing. So you always try and have a plan B for each player and each position, and not just look at what does my roster look like right now? How can I make it as good as I can for tonight's lineup? But what do I do if scenarios? Who's going to be the next guy? Who can I call up? What can I do? What kind of asset management am I looking at for a long-term solution? That would be one that I can think of off the top of my head.
Interesting. So how do you, because like I would imagine that in the retail market, like you're working with actual people, right? So in terms of succession planning, like you can really set yourself up where you're pushing the people who would be, filling in some of those holes if some of your better people move on. You can really work on that individual development. How do you integrate that sort of management into your pool when, like, obviously you're not going to be involved in the actual development of the players coming up?
Right. So that does make it a little bit challenging in that, I'm not actually the manager or the coach of this hockey team because it's a fantasy team. But if I look at my roster and I have a player who, is on a veteran who's on going year to year, like Solani was at the end of his career. Maybe he comes back next year. Maybe he's good. Or maybe he comes back next year and he's no longer fantasy relevant. Or maybe this is it. Maybe he's done. So I'll have that hole in my roster next year. You got to have someone who you can either move up from your prospect bench and plug in and fill that hole, or have another position identified where, so if I lose Solani, I'll be really thin on right wing, but I'm really deep on defense. So, no big deal. Solani retires, I'll just trade one of my defensemen for the winger that I need. Always kind of looking like, if you're playing chess, you look 2 or 3 moves ahead. Kind of the same thing with your fantasy roster. Always try and look 2 or 3 moves ahead. What's this player's value? What's their perceived value versus their real value? And which way are those values trending? And always try and capitalize and trade a player while their value is high before it starts bottoming out. Kind of like Wayne Simmons.
Exactly. Well, that was really fun, Pete. I'm happy that you were able to have me on. I hope that the listeners don't mind us running a little longer than what's usual here. But I had a really good time chatting with this stuff with you, and I'm glad you were willing to answer some of my questions, having the script flipped on you a little bit. But hopefully, some of those insights are helpful. I know they're going to be helpful to me. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast with me today. I also enjoyed this conversation. I thought it was really fun, very interesting. And don't worry, if people don't find it interesting, they just won't listen. Hopefully they made it to the 146 mark here. All right, Steve. We should wrap this up. Thanks very much. I'd like to tell our listeners where they can find your writing and whatnot, but that isn't anywhere right now, unfortunately. Hopefully you miss it a lot and you come back to it, man, because you had a good thing going. You had fun to read.
Yeah, we'll see what shakes out as far as the writing goes. Hopefully I'll have my fantasy rankings out for free again next year. And if people like what I have to say, I'm still spitting nonsense on Twitter at Steve Laidlaw. So they can give me a follow, and I'm always happy to interact.
All right. So there you go, folks. Give them a follow on Twitter. Follow the podcast as well at DPR_show. If you want to follow me at Farling, PHARLING. And don't forget, subscribe to the podcast. Give us a little 5-star review. Drop a comment. Tell me what you like about the show, and I'll do more of that. Until then, thanks for your time, and you can thank me for mine, and we'll see you on the next episode. Cheers.